The color of invisibility was a pale, dusty gray. It was the shade of the forgotten book on a high shelf, the moth that flutters at the edge of the candlelight, the stone of the wall I was pressed against. My stepmother, Beatrice, had chosen my gown herself, a masterful stroke of passive cruelty. It was a color that drank the light and gave nothing back, ensuring I would fade into the alcove she had assigned me, a decorative ghost for the Ashworth summer ball. "Do try to look pleasant, Elara," she had murmured earlier, her fingers pinching the back of my arm with a viper's speed. "No one expects you to be a diamond, but you needn't be a thundercloud. It reflects poorly on the family." My sister, Rosamund, a vision in rose-petal silk, had given me a look of pity that stung more than Beatrice's malice. She was the diamond. Her laughter was like the chime of crystal, her beauty a thing of such effortless radiance that it cast everyone else into shadow. I lived perpetually in that shadow, a place I had long ago accepted as my own. My father, a man hollowed out by a grief he refused to name and a new wife he refused to challenge, simply looked past me, his gaze always finding a more comfortable place to land. So I stood in my alcove, a glass of untouched lemonade warming in my hand, and watched the vibrant swirl of the ton. I was a student of these moments, an archivist of my own insignificance. I observed the subtle shifts in power, the flirtations conducted with the flick of a fan, the social assassinations delivered with a smile. It was a different kind of map than the ones I cherished in secret, the ancient hand-drawn charts of forgotten coastlines and celestial bodies that were my only true companions. But a map nonetheless. I traced the pathways of ambition and desire, a silent cartographer of a world in which I had no place. The ballroom air, thick with perfume and the heat of 100 bodies, suddenly stilled. A silence rippled out from the grand entrance, a wave that hushed whispers and halted dancers mid-step. I leaned forward, my curiosity a small, brave bird in the cage of my chest. He had arrived. Duke Alistair Vance, the Duke of Blackwood. He was a man made of winter and shadow. Everything about him was severe. The stark black of his coat, the sharp lines of his jaw, the unnerving stillness of his gray eyes. He was impossibly wealthy, impossibly powerful, and a recluse who had not attended a London ball in 5 years, not since the tragedy that had claimed his younger brother. His presence here was an earthquake, and every eye was on him, measuring, wondering, coveting. Beatrice was a statue of perfect poise, but I saw the avarice glittering in her eyes. Rosamund was her intended offering. My beautiful sister was maneuvered to the forefront, positioned like a prize jewel on velvet. The Duke's gaze swept the room, cold and dismissive. It passed over the hopeful mothers, the blushing debutantes, and my sister's brilliant smile without a flicker of interest. His eyes moved with a slow, deliberate precision, a hawk searching for something no one else could see. And then they found me. It was impossible. It was a mistake. I shrank back into my gray dress, willing the stone of the alcove to absorb me. But his gaze did not waver. It held me pinned, a specimen under glass. For a terrifying, heart-stopping moment, I felt seen. Not just noticed, but truly, deeply seen. He saw past the dull gray of my gown, past the practiced stillness of my demeanor, and looked directly into the terrified, observant soul within. He started walking, not toward the receiving line, not toward my father, not toward the glittering diamond that was my sister. He walked directly toward my forgotten corner of the room. The whispers followed him, a frantic, rustling tide. Each step he took was a drumbeat against my ribs. The world narrowed to the space between us, a vast, terrifying expanse of polished marble floor. He stopped before me. He was taller than I had imagined, a looming presence that blocked out the light and noise of the rest of the world. His eyes, which had seemed like chips of ice from a distance, were closer to the color of a storm-tossed sea, deep and complex and holding a startling intelligence. "Miss Ashworth," he said. His voice was a low rumble, devoid of the fawning courtesies I was used to hearing. It was a voice that expected to be obeyed. I could only manage a faint, breathless sound in response. He gestured with his chin toward the ornate ceiling, a masterpiece of frescoes depicting the 9 muses. The artisan was Giovanni Valeriani, he stated, not asked, but the patron, Lord Ashworth, insisted on a modification to Urania. He believed her globe was astronomically inaccurate for the period. Do you know what the specific error was? The question was so bizarre, so utterly out of place in the context of a ballroom introduction, that it shocked me out of my fear. It was a question from my world, the world of books and facts and quiet study. It was a question meant for me, not for the pretty empty-headed girl they all assumed me to be. I found my voice, though it was thin and reedy. Lord Ashworth believed Valeriani had depicted the constellations from a modern Copernican perspective, I said, my words gaining confidence as I spoke. He insisted they be reverted to a Ptolemaic model to be historically accurate to the house's construction, despite Valeriani's protests that it was artistically inferior. The argument is detailed in the 3rd volume of my father's journals. A flicker of something, not a smile, but an easing of the harsh line of his mouth, crossed his face. You have read them. All 7 volumes, I confirmed. They are quite dry, unless one has an interest in architectural squabbles. I find them fascinating, the Duke said, his gaze unwavering. As I found the monograph on ancient Phoenician celestial navigation published in the Royal Antiquarian's Quarterly last spring, the author chose anonymity. A shame. It was the most insightful piece of scholarship I have read in a decade. The floor fell away from my feet. My monograph, my secret work, submitted under a simple, untraceable initial, the product of 1,000 stolen hours, written by candlelight in the cold of my room. He had read it. He had understood it. He was speaking of it here, in this room full of people who thought me less than dust. I could not speak. I could only stare at him, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. He knew. Somehow, he knew. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. You're a terrible dancer, I presume. The abrupt change of subject was dizzying. The worst, I managed to whisper. Excellent, he said. I despise dancing. You will accompany me to the terrace. The air in here is suffocating. It was not a request. He offered his arm, and without a conscious thought, my hand was on his sleeve. The fabric of his coat was fine wool, cool and solid beneath my trembling fingers. As he led me from the alcove, the wave of whispers broke behind us, a roar of shock and disbelief. I caught a glimpse of Beatrice's face. It was a mask of incandescent fury, her skin stretched taut over her bones. For the first time in my life, I was not the invisible one. I was the mystery, and the sight of her rage was a strange, terrifying, and exhilarating thing. The days that followed were a disorienting dream. An invitation arrived the next morning, delivered by a footman in the Duke of Blackwood's severe black and silver livery. It was addressed to me and me alone. An invitation to view the celestial maps in his private library. Beatrice had tried to intercept it, of course. A mistake, surely, she'd said, her smile as thin as a razor's edge. He meant it for Rosamund. The man was likely confused. But my name was there, written in the Duke's own sharp, decisive hand, Miss Elara Ashworth. My father, flustered and anxious to avoid any conflict with a man of the Duke's stature, had simply wrung his hands and insisted I must accept. For once, Beatrice was powerless to stop it. She could not risk a public slight against the Duke. Her fury was a silent, simmering poison in the house, making the air thick and hard to breathe. The Duke's townhouse was a fortress of granite and silence on the most imposing square in London. It felt less like a home and more like a mausoleum, a monument to the grief that was said to have walled him off from the world. The butler who admitted me was as old and silent as the stone itself, leading me through halls where the portraits on the walls seemed to watch with cold, ancestral eyes. I expected to be afraid, but the moment I stepped into his library, the fear dissolved. It was the most beautiful room I had ever seen. It was a cathedral dedicated to knowledge. Books soared from floor to ceiling on 2 levels, connected by a spiraling cast-iron staircase. Globes of the earth and the heavens stood like silent sentinels, and in the center of the room, on a massive oak table, was a map so large it covered the entire surface. The Duke was standing by the fireplace, watching me. He was not dressed for society, but in a simple white shirt and dark trousers. Without the stiff formality of his evening coat, he seemed younger, though no less intense. "Welcome, Miss Ashworth," he said, his voice quiet in the vast space. Your Grace, I murmured, my eyes still drinking in the sight of the room. This is magnificent. It is a collection started by my great-grandfather, he said, walking toward the table. He believed that to understand the world, one must first understand how it has been seen by others. He gestured to the map. This is a Fra Mauro, a reproduction, of course. The original does not leave Venice. I approached the table, my fingers itching to touch the heavy parchment. I knew the map intimately from sketches and descriptions. It was a masterpiece of medieval cartography, a perfect circle encompassing the known world, with south at the top, crammed with annotations and fantastical illustrations. Your monograph, he said, his voice directly behind me, making me start. You argued that the navigational charts of the Phoenicians were not based on coastal landmarks, as is commonly believed, but on a complex system of celestial triangulation that has been lost to us. You posited that they could calculate longitude with a degree of accuracy not seen again until the 18th century. It is a theory, I said, my voice barely a whisper. I felt exposed, as if he had peeled back my skull and was reading the thoughts directly from my mind. It is a brilliant one, he corrected me, his tone flat and factual, which made the compliment land with even greater force. You drew a line between their star charts, the orientation of their temples, and the trade routes they established. A line no one else had ever seen. He paused. Why did you publish it anonymously? I turned to face him. The question hung in the air between us, heavy and personal. Because the author is a woman, I said simply, and the world of academia has little time for the theories of unmarried girls who have never attended a university. It was the plain, unvarnished truth of my life, a truth I had never spoken aloud to anyone. He held my gaze, and in his eyes I saw not pity, but a cold, hard anger, an anger on my behalf. The world is full of fools, he stated. It was a simple declaration, but it felt like a validation of my entire existence. He was not consoling me. He was agreeing with me. He was on my side of the wall. He showed me his collection. We spent hours there, in the quiet, dusty light of the library. He spoke of his travels, of seeing the night sky from the deserts of Egypt, and I spoke of the worlds I had only visited in books. It was not a courtship. It was a meeting of minds, a conversation that flowed as if we had been having it for years. For the first time, I did not feel like a ghost. I felt solid, real, and profoundly, shockingly visible. He began sending small gifts, not flowers or jewels, but things that spoke to the conversation we were having. A rare edition of Halley's Star Atlas, a small, beautifully crafted brass astrolabe, a packet of charcoal pencils perfect for sketching charts. Each gift was a quiet acknowledgement, a continuation of our dialogue. Beatrice watched these deliveries with a mounting venomous jealousy. "He is toying with you, you foolish girl," she hissed one afternoon, after a small, leather-bound volume of poetry arrived. "A man like that, a duke, does not concern himself with plain, bookish spinsters. He's amusing himself. When he's done with his little game, he will turn his attention to Rosamund, as is right and proper, and you will be a laughing-stock." Her words were meant to be poison, but they had lost some of their sting. A small, resilient seed of hope had been planted in the barren ground of my heart, and the Duke's quiet, consistent attention was the sun and water that made it grow. I was terrified of it. Hope was a dangerous, fragile thing, but I could not bring myself to stamp it out. Our meetings continued, always in the sanctuary of his library. They were proper, chaperoned by the silent presence of his elderly housekeeper, Mrs. Gable, who would bring us tea and then disappear into the shadows, her expression one of quiet approval. During one of these afternoons, while we were examining a series of charts detailing the Arctic explorations of Captain Cook, he spoke of his brother. It came upon him suddenly. He'd been tracing a route through the ice with his finger, his voice low and academic, when he suddenly stopped. "Thomas wanted to be an explorer," he said, his voice rough with an emotion I had never heard in it before. He stared at the map, but I knew he was seeing something else entirely. He was convinced there was a passage north of Baffin Bay. He was reckless, brilliant, but reckless. He drew his hand back from the map as if it had burned him. I told him he was a fool. I told him his calculations were flawed and his ambition would kill him. We argued. The last words I ever spoke to him were in anger. He turned and walked to the window, his back to me, a rigid silhouette against the gray London light. He went anyway. He and his team were lost in an early ice floe. They never found the ship. The silence in the room was absolute. It was a silence filled with the weight of 5 years of guilt. He had built this fortress of solitude not just out of grief, but out of self-recrimination. He had walled himself in with his last angry words. I did not know what to do. The rules of society offered no guidance for a moment like this. There were no pretty platitudes that could touch a wound so deep. So I walked over to the table, picked up one of the charcoal pencils he had given me, and on a blank corner of the blotter, I began to sketch. I drew the constellation Cygnus, the swan, with its bright star Deneb marking the tail. The Phoenician sailors called this constellation the summer bird, I said softly to his back. They believed it carried the souls of sailors lost at sea back to the heavens so they could navigate for eternity. He didn't turn around for a long time. When he finally did, the harsh, severe mask he wore was gone. His face was stripped bare, and I saw a vulnerability, a profound sadness that made my own heart ache in sympathy. He looked at me, and for the first time, I saw not just a duke, not just an intellect, but a man who was drowning in a silent sea of his own making. He walked back to the table and stood beside me, looking down at my small sketch. His hand came to rest near mine, his fingers just a breath away from touching my own. The space between us crackled with a new and terrifying energy. It was no longer just a meeting of minds, it was something more. "Thank you, Elara," he whispered. He had used my given name, and in that moment the fragile seed of hope in my chest burst into a wild, impossible bloom. The Duke's carriage became a regular sight outside our townhouse. Society was buzzing. Beatrice was apoplectic. She saw her grandest ambition, marrying Rosamund to the Duke, slipping through her fingers, being stolen by the one person she had never even considered a rival. Me, the invisible girl. Her campaign against me escalated from snide remarks to open hostility. She searched my room, looking for some leverage, some secret she could use against me. She found nothing but books and star charts, but Beatrice was nothing if not resourceful in her cruelty. If she could not find a weapon, she would forge one. I was summoned to the Duke's home on a Tuesday. The note was terse, the handwriting sharp and unlike his usual measured script. A sense of dread coiled in my stomach as I rode in the carriage. The air had the heavy electric feel of an approaching storm. When I was shown into the library, it was not the sanctuary I had come to love. The curtains were drawn, casting the room in a gloomy twilight. The fire was out, the hearth a black, cold mouth. Alistair was not waiting for me by the map table. He was standing behind his massive desk, a barrier of carved mahogany between us. The man who faced me was the Duke of Blackwood I had seen at the ball, the cold, severe, unapproachable stranger. The warmth, the intellectual camaraderie, the shared vulnerability, all of it was gone, replaced by a wall of glacial ice. "Your Grace?" I asked, my voice trembling. He did not answer. He simply tossed a letter onto the polished surface of the desk. It slid toward me. The paper was cheap, the handwriting a flowery, uneducated scrawl. "An explanation would seem to be in order," he said, his voice flat and dead. I picked it up with numb fingers. I read the first few lines, and the world tilted on its axis. It was a letter, supposedly from a jilted lover, a stable hand my family had dismissed months ago. It was a vile, crude thing, full of fabricated endearments and sordid details. It painted me as a manipulative schemer, a woman who had used the poor boy for her pleasure and then cast him aside, all while plotting to entrap a wealthy, titled man. It claimed my entire courtship with the Duke was a calculated fraud. "This is a lie," I whispered, the words catching in my throat. I have never—" "Have you not?" he cut in, his voice like the crack of a whip. "The author seems quite familiar with the details of your life. He even mentions your penchant for sneaking out to the old observatory at night, a habit I myself was unaware of. For stargazing, you told me, or for a different kind of celestial appointment." I stared at him, my mind reeling. The observatory. Beatrice. She must have seen me go there. She had twisted my one private solace into something ugly and cheap. Alistair, you cannot possibly believe this, I pleaded, taking a step toward the desk. Do not use my name, he snarled, and the venom in his voice struck me like a physical blow. He was looking at me with utter contempt. The man who had shared his deepest grief with me was gone. In his place was a stranger, his face a mask of cold fury and betrayal. The ghost of his brother, and the betrayal he felt in that, had been resurrected by this cheap forgery. He had been hurt before, and he had been primed to believe the worst. Beatrice had not just written a letter, she had found the key to the lock on his heart and turned it, trapping him back inside his prison of suspicion. I thought you were different, he said, his voice low and guttural with self-loathing. I thought I had found something genuine, an intellect, a quiet integrity. I allowed myself to be deceived by a clever performance. He gave a short, bitter laugh that held no humor. It seems your stepmother was right about you after all. A grasping, ambitious little creature, hiding behind a facade of scholarship. Every word was a nail being hammered into my coffin. He had spoken to Beatrice. She had laid the groundwork, planted the seeds of doubt, and this letter was the bitter harvest. I felt the fragile structure of my newfound self-worth begin to crumble. The hope that had bloomed so brightly shriveled and died, turning to ash in my chest. He would not listen to me. He had already tried and convicted me in the cold courtroom of his own past trauma. I lifted my chin. The tears that burned behind my eyes would not fall. I would not give him the satisfaction. I had been a ghost my entire life. I knew how to be still, how to endure. But something had changed in me over the past weeks. I was no longer content to simply fade away. You are a fool, I said, my voice quiet but clear in the silent room. His eyes narrowed. What did you say? I said you are a fool, Your Grace, I repeated, the formal address a deliberate twist of the knife. You, who pride yourself on your perception and your intellect. You see conspiracy and betrayal in a cheap, clumsy forgery because it is what you expect to see. It is easier for you to believe that I am a monster than to believe that you were wrong to shut yourself away from the world. This has nothing to do with me. It has everything to do with your brother and your own cowardice. A muscle jumped in his jaw. For a moment, I thought he might strike me. The fury in his eyes was a living thing. Then, his expression shuddered completely, becoming a void. He straightened up, the remote and powerful Duke once more. Did you truly believe, he said, his voice dropping to a lethally soft whisper, a man like me could be interested in someone like you? It was a diversion, a curiosity, a fleeting intellectual amusement. He paused, letting the words hang in the air, each one a perfectly crafted dart aimed at my most vulnerable places. Then came the final, killing blow. I never loved you. He swore it. The words were an oath, a curse, a final closing of a door I had only just begun to hope might open. I did not shatter. I did not weep. Something inside me went very cold and very calm. I looked at him, at this man who had shown me a glimpse of what it felt like to be seen, only to plunge me back into a deeper darkness. I looked at him and felt a profound and desolate pity. He was the one in the prison, not me. I turned without another word and walked out of the library. I walked through the silent, echoing halls, past the disapproving portraits, and out the massive front door into the rain that had begun to fall. I did not look back. That night, I packed a small bag. I took my books, my charts, and the small brass astrolabe he had given me. I wrote a short, simple note for my father, and I left the house where I had only ever been a shadow. I walked out into the London night with no destination in mind, only the certain knowledge that I could not stay. I would rather be a ghost in the wide, uncaring world than in the suffocating confines of that house, or in the memory of a man who saw me as nothing more than a diversion. I walked out that night, and for the first time in my life, I was entirely, terrifyingly, and blessedly on my own. He meant it. In that cold, dark library, Alistair Vance, Duke of Blackwood, had meant every word. The forged letter had not been merely a spark. It had been a torch thrown into a powder keg of unresolved grief and a deep-seated fear of betrayal. My sharp, true words about his brother had only confirmed his worst fears, that I had seen his weakness and sought to exploit it. In that moment, He needed to believe I was the villain. It was a shield, a way to cauterize the wound of his burgeoning hope before it could be truly injured. He pushed me away with all the force of his considerable will, because letting me in had become an unbearable risk. He meant it, until I was gone. The silence I left behind in the library was different from the silence he had cultivated for 5 years. That had been a silence of control, of chosen solitude. This new silence was a void. It was the negative space where I had been. He stood at his desk for a long time, the echo of the closing door, a physical presence in the room. He expected to feel relief, vindicated, the cold, satisfying certainty of having rooted out a deception. Instead, he felt nothing. Just a vast, hollow ache. He picked up the letter again. His mind, no longer clouded by the red mist of anger and hurt, began to work with its customary precision. He saw things he had missed. The ink was slightly smeared as if dried in a hurry. The turn of phrase, celestial appointment, was too literary for a stable hand. It sounded more like Beatrice. He remembered the venom in her tone when she had spoken of me, a tone he had dismissed at the time as simple jealousy. He had wanted to believe her because it was easier. My final words came back to him. You are a fool. Not an insult, he realized now, but a diagnosis. He had behaved like a fool, blinded by his own ghosts. He had taken the most genuine thing to enter his life in 5 years and deliberately, cruelly destroyed it. The emptiness in his chest solidified into a cold, sharp dread. He yanked the bell pull, his movements jerky and violent. His butler appeared, his expression impassive. "Find out where that letter came from," the Duke commanded, his voice raw. "Find the stable hand, John Smalls. Find out who paid him. Use whomever you must. I want an answer by morning." Then he did something he had not done since his brother's death. He walked to the liquor cabinet, poured a tumbler of brandy, and drank it in a single burning swallow. But the alcohol did nothing to numb the chilling realization that he had made a catastrophic, unforgivable mistake. He had believed a lie because the truth, that someone of my quiet integrity could genuinely care for him, was too frightening to contemplate. By dawn, his investigators had confirmed it all. The stable hand had been dismissed 2 months prior for theft and held a grudge. He had been paid a handsome sum by a veiled lady in a hired carriage to write the letter from a script she provided. The description of the lady in the carriage matched Beatrice perfectly. They had also, with ruthless efficiency, uncovered other things. Beatrice had been systematically selling off pieces of my late mother's dowry, which was legally mine, to fund her extravagant lifestyle. The cruelty was not just emotional, it was criminal. The Duke did not rage. His anger became something colder, denser, and far more dangerous. It became a plan. He arrived at my father's house just before noon. He did not ask to see me. He requested a formal meeting with Lord Ashworth, Lady Ashworth, and Miss Rosamund Ashworth in the main drawing room. His very presence so soon after my departure sent a wave of panic through the household. They gathered, my father looking bewildered, Beatrice triumphant, and Rosamund worried. Beatrice believed he had come to formalize his courtship of Rosamund, now that the obstacle had been removed. She wore her most charming smile. "Your Grace," she began, her voice like honey, "to what do we owe this unexpected pleasure?" Alistair did not sit. He stood in the center of the room, a figure of uncompromising judgment. He placed a small leather portfolio on the table. "I have come to discuss a matter of fraud," he said, his voice quiet and deadly. Beatrice's smile faltered. He laid it all out with methodical, brutal precision. He produced the stable hand-signed confession. He produced the bank draft showing the payment, traced back to an account Beatrice held under a false name. He produced the forged letter itself. He did not raise his voice. He simply presented the facts, each one a stone laid upon Beatrice's social grave. "You concocted a vile and slanderous lie to destroy a reputation," he said, his cold eyes fixed on her. "You did so out of greed and malice." Beatrice's face had gone from triumphant to ashen. "It's a lie, a conspiracy. The girl has bewitched you," she hissed, her mask of civility cracking to reveal the ugly desperation beneath. "And then," the Duke continued, as if she hadn't spoken, opening the portfolio further, "there is the matter of the dowry of the First Lady Ashworth, her jewelry, the land holdings, all systematically sold over the past 10 years, the funds diverted. He looked at my father, whose face had crumpled in on itself with dawning horror and shame. "Were you aware, Lord Ashworth, that your wife has been robbing your daughter blind for a decade?" My father could only shake his head, speechless. It was Rosamund who spoke. Her face was pale with shock and disgust. "You did this," she whispered, staring at Beatrice. "All this time, the things you said about Elara, you were hurting her, stealing from her." The naive pity she had always shown me was gone, replaced by a righteous fury. "She's gone because of you." "She was a worthless, scheming little bookworm," Beatrice shrieked, her control finally shattering. "She was in my way." "She was never in your way," the Duke said, his voice dropping even lower. "You were in hers, and you will be no longer." He turned his attention to my father. "You have two choices, Lord Ashworth. You can have your wife quietly committed to a sanatorium in the countryside for her nerves, where she will remain indefinitely, and this matter will remain private. Or I will present this evidence to the authorities, and the Ashworth name will be dragged through a scandal from which it will never recover. The choice is yours. You have 1 hour to decide." He turned and walked out of the room, leaving ruin in his wake. My father, finally shaken from his passive weakness, looked at the woman he had allowed to terrorize his daughter and saw her for what she was. Rosamund was already weeping, not for her family's reputation, but for the sister she had failed to protect. Beatrice's reign was over. But for Alistair, the victory was hollow. He had dispensed justice, but it did not mend what he had broken. He had to find me. I had found refuge with my old governess, Mrs. Pembroke, a kind woman who lived in a small, tidy cottage in a village just outside London. She had taken me in without question, tutting over my exhaustion and giving me a warm bed and hot tea. For 2 days, I did nothing but sleep and stare out the window at her small, rain-washed garden, feeling like a ship that had been torn from its moorings, adrift on a vast gray sea. I was free, but I was lost. On the 3rd day, a carriage stopped at the gate, not a grand ducal carriage, but a simple, unmarked brougham, when Mrs. Pembroke answered the door. Her eyes went wide. It was the Duke. He did not demand to see me. He asked, politely, humbly. Mrs. Pembroke looked at me, her expression questioning. I nodded, my heart beginning a slow, heavy drumbeat. He entered the small parlor, and he seemed too large for it, his presence filling the cozy space with a tense, crackling energy. He had not slept. There were dark circles under his eyes, and his face was drawn and pale. The impenetrable armor of his ducal authority was gone. He just looked like a man in agony. "Elara," he began, his voice rough. He stopped, as if the words were physically difficult to say. "There's no excuse for my behavior. None. I can only offer an explanation." He told me everything. He told me about Beatrice's lies, about the investigation, about the confrontation. He told me how he had allowed the ghost of his brother and his guilt over their last argument to poison his ability to trust. "When Thomas died," he said, his eyes fixed on the worn rug at his feet, "a part of me died with him. The part that believed in goodness, in trust. I saw betrayal everywhere. When Beatrice presented her fabrication, it fit the narrative I had built for myself. The world was a treacherous place, and I had been a fool to let my guard down." He finally looked up, and the pain in his eyes was so raw it was difficult to look at. "What I said to you, it was abhorrent. I was trying to hurt you because I was terrified of how much you were beginning to mean to me. It was an act of profound cowardice, the very thing you accused me of." I stood by the window, my arms wrapped around myself, listening. I did not make it easy for him. I let the silence stretch, forcing him to inhabit the uncomfortable space of his own confession. He took a hesitant step toward me. "I know I have no right to ask for your forgiveness. I shattered your trust, and I may have destroyed the most important thing I have ever found." He reached into his coat and pulled out a small folded piece of paper. It was my sketch of Cygnus. He had kept it. "You showed me a constellation," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You offered me a way to see my grief not as an end, but as a journey. You gave me a gift, and I threw it back in your face." He stopped just before me, close enough that I could feel the heat radiating from him. I don't know how to fix what I have broken, but I must try. I came here not as a duke, but as a man. A foolish, arrogant man who is desperately in love with you. The words I had longed to hear, the words he had so cruelly denied, were finally spoken. But they were not a triumphant declaration. They were a broken plea. I do not ask you to come back to my world of titles and society, he continued, his voice dropping to a whisper. I ask you to let me into yours, the world of books and maps and stars. Be my partner, Elara, my equal, my navigator. Teach me how to chart a course out of the darkness. Marry me. He was not offering me a title or a fortune. He was offering me his broken pieces, asking if I could help him put them back together. He was not rescuing me. He was asking me to rescue him. He had finally, truly, seen me not as a curiosity or a project, but as his guiding star. The tears I had refused to shed in his library finally came. They were not tears of pain, but of a deep, shuddering, cathartic release. I wept for the invisible girl I had been, for the pain I had endured, and for the astonishing, terrifying beauty of this moment. He did not touch me. He waited, giving me the space to feel it all. When the tears subsided, I looked up at him. You are a fool, Alistair Vance, I whispered, echoing my words from that terrible day. But this time, they were not an accusation. They were an acceptance, an endearment. A look of profound relief washed over his face. So potent it was, as if he had been holding his breath for days. The biggest one you will ever know, he agreed, his voice hoarse. Then I suppose you will need a navigator to keep you from running aground, I said. And then he kissed me. It was not a gentle kiss. It was a kiss of desperation and relief, of gratitude and profound apology. It was the end of a very long winter, the breaking of a storm, the first light of dawn after the darkest night. It was the feeling of being found after being lost for a very, very long time. It was the feeling of being home. 1 year later, we were in the observatory. Not the small, dilapidated one of my youth, but the one we had built together on the highest hill of his country estate, Blackwood Manor. It was a magnificent structure of white stone and gleaming brass, its dome open to the velvet black of the night sky. Alistair stood behind me, his arms wrapped around my waist, his chin resting on my shoulder as I leaned over the eyepiece of the great telescope. The light from a nearby lantern illuminated the chart on the table beside us, a chart we were making ourselves. There, I murmured, making a final delicate mark with a charcoal pencil. I think that's it. I pulled back and he leaned in to look. The Elara cluster, he said, his voice soft with a quiet pride that never failed to make my heart swell. A grouping of 7 previously unclassified stars. It's perfect. He straightened up, turning me in his arms to face him. The moonlight streamed through the open dome, silvering his hair and casting his severe, beautiful features in soft relief. The haunted look was gone from his eyes, replaced by a deep, steady warmth that was reserved only for me. Are you happy? He asked. It was a question he asked me often, a quiet check-in, a reminder that he would never again take my presence for granted. I looked around the observatory, our sanctuary of shared passion. I thought of the London townhouse, now filled with light and the murmur of quiet conversation, no longer a mausoleum, but a home. I thought of Rosamund, who visited often and had become my truest friend, her own happiness secured with a kind-hearted baron who loved her for her sweet nature, not her beauty. I thought of my father, living out his days in quiet retirement, sending me contrite letters and books he thought I might enjoy. And I thought of Beatrice, a permanent resident of a remote health retreat, her name never spoken. I had gone from a ghost in a gray dress to the Duchess of Blackwood, but that was not the source of my happiness. My title was a circumstance, my happiness was a state of being. It came from being seen, from being known, from being valued for the contents of my mind and the integrity of my soul. Alistair, I said, reaching up to trace the line of his jaw. I spent the first 20 years of my life believing I was a footnote in someone else's story. You have shown me that I am the author of my own. I smiled, a real, unreserved smile. And our story is my favorite. He leaned down and kissed me, a slow, gentle kiss full of unspoken promises and shared understanding. Outside, the stars wheeled in their silent, eternal dance, no longer just distant points of light for a lonely girl to study, but the beautiful, familiar landmarks of home. I was no longer invisible. I was the center of a universe, and it was more magnificent than any I had ever charted.